Yes, so basically today we're going to talk about the case study from Vietnam. In particular, the topic will be on the impact of political coalition on national REDD policies, a case study from Vietnam. So I just want to say thanks to Maria, Monica, and Moira, and many colleagues of mine back in Vietnam that who cannot be able to be here with us today. So basically for that particular presentation, we presented the finding that we found for particularly two research questions. What are the key events that shape the national REDD policies in Vietnam, and how do influential actors as well as their coalition engage, controls and influence these events? So basically there are three major events that shaping the REDD policies decision-making process in Vietnam. The first one is actually what we call the national PS policy, naming the decision 380 and the decree 99. So in 2008, the government, with support from various donors, piloted the national payment for environmental services in Vietnam with into province. And then in 2009, they actually nationalized the national PS scheme across the country. And then on that particular event and policy, they consider REDD as one type of environmental services that are subjected for the management of the government. The second event, which is the UN REDD program. So the UN REDD programs, they invested in Vietnam for the first phase about $5 million, and the second phase probably about $100 million. And this is one of the key events that driving the national REDD policies in Vietnam. The third one is actually looking at the subtechnical working group on REDD, which is driven by the Norway's government in collaboration with the governments of Vietnam. So here we have quite interesting event, because for the first event it's actually government driven and everyone's behind the scenes is the government. But for the second one, it's actually donor driven, particularly UN REDD and Norway. And the third event, which is the collaboration between the donors and government. So it's quite interesting to see. So in here, basically, we're showing this diagram, the involvement of different actors. Basically, 54 organizations that we identify as the key actors influencing the development of REDD policies in Vietnam. And in here, there were showing the involvement. There's involvement in these, these three events. I won't go in detail in each event, but just a few points that we would like to highlight in that one. The first one is that the media is only engaged in the first event, where the government driven the process. And the national, the business sector, the private sectors also only engage in the first event only. They don't participate in any other two events. And the second thing is the size of the circle showing how influential the actors are. And you can see some of the influential actors, they didn't participate in any of these three events. There was a lot of reason behind that. But interestingly, the Norway, the NORAD and Norway's embassy, they didn't involve in any event. So for that particular first event, in here we try not only to understanding who involving in that event, but also try to understanding their perception and whether or not they agree or they against this event. And if you can see here, basically, everyone is the national private sectors and the medias and the government agency seem to be supporting this event and this policy. But in here, the international organization and donor, they seem to be like partly agree and partly against. And mostly it's because they don't agree with the is either the command and controls approach with the payment for environmental services approach. Because for the PS policies in Vietnam, the government forced the private sector, particularly the hydropower companies and the water supply company, to pay a certain percentage out of their benefit to what we call the National Forest Protection and Development Fund. So even though some of the donors was involved, but they are not totally agree with the approach that the government want to adopt. So in here, I don't see anyone, show their disagreement toward the policy. Only like, parties agree and parties against. For the second event, which is like the REDD program, you can see that the media wasn't involved, the private sector wasn't involved in here, and many government agencies and many international NGOs and civil society groups are not involved at all in that particular one. In here, I think it was quite interesting because there was at least two international NGOs and donors. Although they participate in that event, they don't necessarily support or agree with the approach that the REDD program undertakes. And many of those on the left-hand side decided that they didn't want to involve in it as well. So for the third event, which is the establishment and the operation of the National REDD Technical Working Group, even though it's a joint collaboration between the governments and the donors, particularly the REDD and the Norwegian government, but in that particular one, you can see that many people didn't agree with that program, and many of the actors decided that they don't want to participate in that event, but it doesn't necessarily that they disagree. Just going back to the first event, which is this one, at least for the last few years in Vietnam, we can see that REDD, even though the donor puts a lot of fundings and technical support for Vietnam to pilot the REDD programs, what it has shown clearly in the media discourse analysis and the other case study is the fact that the government, particularly at the provincials and the local government, they are much more interested in PES rather than REDD, because with the PES, they feel that it gets more control under the government rather than the other program. But Monica just mentioned earlier that we have one type of the network, which is actually showing the disagreement and the conflict of actors who are involving in this three network. And when we're asking this question, only the disagreement was shown among private sectors and government agencies. And then if you're looking at the actors who are identify themselves and they have some sort of conflict and disagreement with the other, they all within the event one, which is the government policies network. So even though the government, really want to adopt and promote the PES, and the government as well at the local level, communities and NGOs promoted PES rather than REDD, but it's contained a lot of conflict in this particular one. Yeah, so this is our initial finding on the three key events. Yeah. Yes, I think, yeah. Yeah. Yes, so I didn't have any kind of wordy things, but this is actually my conclusion by the challenges that we face, particularly how to nationalize the PES scheme when there was so much conflict involving between the private sector, and the government. You see.